people hand in hand. Have I lived to see the milk and honey land, where hate's a dream and love forever stands? Or is this a vision in my mind? No, da, 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 da. The law was never passed, but somehow all men feel they are truly free at last. Have we really gone this far through space and time? Or is this just a vision in our mind? I am not one who make believes. I know that leaves are green. They only turn to brown when autumn comes around. I know just what I say. Today's not yesterday, and all things have an ending. But what I like to know is, could a place like this exist so beautiful? Or do we have to take our wings and fly away to a vision in our mind? I know that leaves are green. They only turn to brown when autumn comes around. I know just what I say. Today's not yesterday, and all things have an ending. But what I like to know is, could a place like this exist so beautiful? Or do we have to take our wings and fly away to a vision in our minds?
Hello everyone. I am Aki Spadaro. I am the co-director of the Goa Jazz Academy. This was a performance by Anuba Kaul and myself. Anuba is a vocal teacher at Goa Jazz Academy. The song was Visions by Stevie Wonder, and we played it for you piano and voice with this beast over there behind my shoulders. Welcome to my studio. We are here today to celebrate the International Jazz Day, 30th of April. Why UNESCO has decided to establish this celebration? First of all, it tells us that jazz is a patrimony that needs to be preserved, that needs to be protected, and that is why it is studied in all conservatories and music schools across the world. And secondly, for the same reason, that it belongs to humanity. Although it's a music that, as you know, has its own geographical and chronological origin, it belongs to everyone. And this is why a piano player who was born in the late 80s in Italy and now works in India can sit here and tell some parts of the history of it. Some needed premise before starting this journey. As I just said, jazz has a very rich history. I could be talking to you for hours and hours and hours. So what I'm going to be doing now is as if, let's say, if jazz was a very large old tree, I would be extracting just a small sample of it, from the core to the surface and looking across the different eras. But we shouldn't confuse this operation of taking this small sample with the entire thing. I'm specifically going to talk about jazz piano, and I'm going to omit many things. Even within the topic of jazz piano, I will have to omit many important names. Another important omission which I'm going to operate is that I'm not going to talk much about improvisation. If you are familiar with jazz a little bit, you must know how crucial improvisation it is. However, there's much more than that. You find plenty of material online about jazz improvisation and language. I am going to talk about something else today. What the technique of this instrument, which is the piano, has absorbed from jazz, from the revolution of jazz music, and what it has given back to it in terms of style, technique, approach, attitude toward the instrument, even physical attitude toward the instrument. The chronology of what I'm going to be talking about spans roughly between the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. That was a very, very crucial century. And I'm going to start by telling a little bit about the history of the piano and the characteristics of it. By the way, you see three of them in this room. We have a digital here. Here there is an upright piano, and back there there's a wonderful grand piano. It's very difficult to tell when this instrument was exactly invented, because in truth it's the result of a quite linear technological evolution. From the early instruments that had very less dynamics, that were much lighter instruments, to then what we consider to be the modern piano, the one that you see on my back. We can roughly tell that the piano as it is now was more or less achieved by the half of the 1800s. So that's when I'm going to that's where we are going to start our journey. Before that, just a couple of characteristics of the piano. You may know them already, but it's good to make a recap. The piano is a polyphonic instrument. It means that it can produce more notes at the same time, unlike other instruments which are monodic. Among the polyphonic instrument, the piano is the one that allows you to visualize all the notes, which makes it a very practical instrument to compose music. The dynamic range of the piano, another characteristic, the actual word piano, it's shortened for pianoforte, which in Italian means soft and loud. And that's because this instrument, unlike other keyboard instruments from the past, is able to produce a very large range of dynamic, from very, very soft to very, very loud. I demonstrated this on the upright because with the sampled piano, it works less well. Third characteristic, the registers. As you can see, I have 88 keys in front of me. I can play very low and very high notes, and that, of course, offers a huge potential in terms of composition and interpretation. So let's have a look in our timeline. So mid 1800, what Western classical music sounded like back then. By far the most important artistic movement of the 1800s was Romanticism. I could say a lot about Romanticism, but I'm going to stick to just a few characteristics that are of our interest right now. Romantic music tends to be very intense, very emotionally engaging, and it often requires very strong technical skills. Piano, because of the characteristic that I listed before, is an instrument that it's very good for romantic music. It offers a lot of possibilities. So let's have a look now at the sonata by Russian composer Sergei Rachmaninoff. Though we must say that Rachmaninoff is a late romantic composer, Romanticism was already the most prominent artistic movement for quite a few decades before, but this video is a good example. So let's see what Rachmaninoff could get out of the modern piano. What does this tell us about romantic piano? Even if it's just played on piano, it's a very orchestral music. There's a large use of bass, there's a large use of chords with many notes, apart from the virtuosity. So it's as if we have the double basses playing and the brass playing. Another example I could give you is a waltz by a Finnish composer Sibelius that goes more or less like this. See if I remember it. Etc, etc. So you see my left hand, you see how I am accompanying with this very low bass and this full chords over here. Let's keep this in mind, because we are going to find these characteristics in a later stage under a different name, but this is going to be very important. Also the waltz. Waltz was a music that was danced in chords. It was a couple dance, very aristocratic, very elegant. Let's keep that in mind because we are going to find it later on. Let's now travel across the Atlantic Ocean, all the way from Russia to the United States, and even a little bit back in time. The sonata from Rachmaninoff, which we just heard, was from 1913. What I'm talking about now, it's a style that was already flourishing in the United States 40 or 50 years before. I'm speaking about ragtime. Ragtime was a music that was only performed on piano and composed by pianists of nearly any ethnicity, although the most important ragtime composer was Scott Joplin. Scott Joplin was a black piano player and composer. Let's have a look at one of his famous ragtime compositions and understand why this becomes relevant to us. So what you have seen, although the music of course sounds much more cheerful and almost frivolous compared to what we heard before, there definitely is a connection on the technical point of view. First of all, ragtime, unlike jazz, is an entirely written music. It could be studied by piano players quite rigorously, but it also presents this characteristic. So you can see here, again with my left hand, I'm alternating chords and bass in this fashion. Okay, this music became quite popular, so if you were to study piano and you were in the US during these decades between, let's say, 1860 and 1910, you were likely to study some ragtime. And this is why the early jazz generation piano players, first of all Jelly Roll Morton, but also many others who come next, took this music and incorporated some new sounds. They incorporated the sounds of blues and they incorporated the swing. Now, one word about the swing. 20s and 30s in the United States were years of very radical cultural changes, also in popular culture and lifestyle, and all of a sudden people wanted to dance. The dance culture as we know it today kind of started off. Of course, humanity has always danced, but dance were either ritualistic or ceremonial or tribal. But the idea of leaving the house in the evening with a bunch of friends and go dance, that's something that took off in those few decades at the beginning of 1900. The music that was danced was swing. It was early jazz. It's hard to believe by listening to what jazz became later that that was actually the dance music of that time. So what happens to ragtime once it was meant to be played and performed to make people move their body? Well, what was before this sort of almost stiff march kind of... Now it becomes more something like this. Let's see, I'm not a great strider, but I'm going to try. Okay, now, apart from changing a bit the rhythm and making it more involving, I also did some very minimal improvisation. I diverged from the ragtime theme. Well, that is most likely a practice that piano players of that time were doing after Jelly Roll Morton. As to show how piano players would have incorporated that in jazz, we're going to see now a short clip from piano player Errol Garner, who also invented his own stride piano. I would like to talk about that, but there's no time, unfortunately. Also, this is a video from the 60s, in truth from much later than the period we are talking about, but he exemplifies it so well and so clearly that I decided to show this clip. So this is Errol Garner performing stride piano in a jazz trio, so with double bass and drums. Sorry, I used that magic word before the video without specifying it. This technique, now that it has incorporated all the elements from the ragtime and from the swing and from the blues, is called stride piano. These few decades produced a large amount of amazing piano players who gathered everything we talked until now and brought it to a very high level of complexity and of technical difficulties. I'm thinking of Art Tatum, I'm thinking of Teddy Wilson, and I could name many, but then I would feel guilty not to say a few words about each one of them, so I'm going to stop now. So now, going back to the 20s and 30s, a larger sound was required to make these big crowds dance, and this is how the jazz orchestras were born, or so-called jazz big band. One of the most important jazz orchestra, if not the most important, was the orchestra of Duke Ellington. The orchestra of Duke Ellington was operating in New York. Duke Ellington was himself a composer and piano player. Now you can tell by the way he plays and by the way he arranges or composes his music for the orchestra, that suddenly the subject of his music is not the piano anymore, it is the orchestra. But you could clearly tell by hearing the same song performed by only Duke Ellington on piano and then by the Duke Ellington Orchestra that the orchestra becomes an extension of the piano. A little bit the opposite than what happened before with the romantic music. We didn't see an orchestral romantic composition, but you could imagine from how that piano player was playing Rachmaninoff that there was a lot of inputs from orchestral music, right? So now the opposite is happening. Duke Ellington is channeling through the piano his ideas for the orchestra, and now the subject is the orchestra. So we are now going to watch these two videos, one after the other, of Duke Ellington performing on solo piano Take the A Train, one of his most famous compositions, and then the same song arranged for the whole orchestra. So as you can see, I decided to leave into the video the trumpet solo and some improvisation. We are not talking about it, so at least we're gonna get to see some in these videos. So let's get back to that time and imagine this music being played in these large venues across the United States. People were going there to dance to it. Everything is nice and golden, and suddenly Second World War kicks in. It was no time anymore for this kind of entertainment, and jazz then undergoes a very radical change. Suddenly, because of this era of swing fading out, this era of big orchestras fading out, there was suddenly space for a completely different approaches. For smaller bands, the language of piano played only as the only instrument without other instruments sort of went on a break, we could say, for a decade or two. Not that they didn't do that, but let's say there was not an important evolution of the piano solo after the end of the swing era. So this produced another generation of players whose improvisational language was much more sophisticated, and that was the bebop. If you don't know what bebop is, please do a small research about that too. One approach that sticks out particularly, and let's say that is coherent with the journey we did until now, from late romantic to ragtime to early swing on piano, is the approach of pianist Bill Evans. Now, everybody who has studied jazz piano has digged into Bill Evans. He was white, he was Jewish, he was born from European parents, and you could tell in his language and his approach to the piano that he gathered again all the informations and characteristics of classical and romantic piano. He studied Chopin, he probably studied Rachmaninoff too. The piano becomes again the subject. So we went from solo piano to jazz orchestras, and then again we are into a relationship, an intimate relationship with the instrument. What we're going to listen now is two interesting videos of Bill Evans playing his own composition called Very Early, first in solo piano in a TV show, and then in trio. So let's have a look at Bill Evans playing his song Very Early. This is a recording from the late 60s. Did you notice anything? The way he plays this composition is again consists of bass notes and chord in the middle register, right? Something like this. And it is again a waltz. You remember we spoke about the waltz at the very beginning of this video. The same content is going back into our journey through the fingers of Bill Evans, who is now playing a waltz, a dance from European 1800, but now is a jazz waltz, and it can be performed with a jazz trio. The approach to the instrument again is evolving. You will see Bill Evans, while performing this composition, at some point really closing himself even physically on the piano, almost like, he's going back into an eggshell, which tells us that the figure of the artist, of the jazz artist, can also be introspective, and jazz can be an introspective music. Certainly not anymore a mass consumption music, but it becomes a music of outstanding depth, both conceptually and emotionally. So this is Bill Evans playing very early now in trio. So in this video you saw Bill Evans being accompanied by double bass and drums. This was already, but after Bill Evans it affirms as the piano trio, which is a formation of players that is very dear to piano players, because it gives to the pianist both the possibility of being the soloist, but also being supported rhythmically and harmonically by double bass and drums. Now, at this point, we reached the 60s, we reached the mid-60s. It is a time in which many musicologists would establish that jazz finishes. In truth, it evolved and merged with other styles all over the world. At this point, really, it's too dissipated to follow a track. But there is one artist that emerged after the 60s, after the alleged end of the jazz movement, that is perfect to conclude this journey. And I'm speaking about American pianist Keith Jarrett, whose birthday is next week, so it's also a perfect chance to speak about him a little bit. He's going to turn 78, if I'm not wrong. Jarrett, already in the early 70s, as I was saying before, that stopped for a little while, played again in piano solo, meaning only with the piano, with no other instrument, in front of very large crowds. The musical background of Keith Jarrett is very comprehensive. He has studied and also recorded and published a large number of classical piano records, as well as experimental jazz, as well as rock jazz together with Miles Davis. But the dimension in which he gave the most important contribution to this history is the piano solo. And you could tell that under his fingers and inside of his body, so to say, he has gathered decades, if not centuries, of knowledge and of musical experience. He can be extremely energetic as well as very contemplative. In this video, which I decided to show, is the end of a performance from the 80s where he is playing Miles Davis' composition Solar. So, in light of what we said, of everything we said until now, of how jazz changed the approach to the instrument, even the physical approach to the instrument. Physical not in sense of technical, but in sense of physical feeling. Keith Jarrett is a perfect example. We are going to see him using techniques we talked until now, but as well you can hear that there are Latin rhythm in the way he plays, South American rhythms, and I find this performance just absolutely thrilling. So you can find the entire thing on YouTube. We're just going to watch the last few minutes. I think this is a wonderful way to conclude this journey. So lots of gratitude for all these artists that gave their contribution, and thank you for your attention, and I hope this gives you the chance to look into these artists in a little more depth than what I could do today, and see you next time.